Alright, well, I'm your MC tonight since it's a bit weird if the talker introduces himself. So, obviously, it's been really good to have a bit of a crowd here tonight, some fresh faces. I am, obviously, Gav and I work here at Nucleus, one of the owners, and which is a space that we sort of enjoy having these events at, so welcome. And obviously, as you probably found out, beers are out there. There's pizzas that will be on the way after the talk. And yeah, in the meantime, we have Michael doing a lovely talk about introducing Laravel, which I'm surprised we haven't had a talk about Laravel yet, but here we go. So, Michael.
Thank you. Great. That's right, I will be out here, you can say that. That's right. Very good. Alright, surprising as it may be, I really tried to avoid talking about Laravel. I wanted to get a really good grasp of the audience and figuring out exactly what everyone's different levels are at, but I've been threatening to do this for a while, and seeing as nobody has actually put their hand up to talk, here I am again. And this is going to be a really high-level introduction. There is some code in it, but I've tried to limit it. I cover about a third of what I wanted to, and I think that's probably going to be enough for everyone anyway, so we will dive straight in. So why use a framework? I think it's important to talk a little bit about the history and a little bit of what we were doing before, and I was just talking to Taylor about it actually. Long ago, developers were responsible not only for the business logic but also the components that were common across sites. So we were writing everything from scratch basically. We were doing user authentication, input validation, database access, templating. All of these things were hand-rolled. Each project was slightly different. There was no commonality. Like if you had a new developer come onto your team, you would spend days, weeks, maybe even months explaining what you had in that custom application. So today we have literally dozens of frameworks across different languages. We've got thousands of packages and components that we can just pull into our projects. And with packages, someone else is responsible for developing and then maintaining the isolated code in that package. So because it's that package, we usually have a well-defined job. In theory, that package's author has a great understanding of that specific task than what you would, and that you wouldn't need to anyway. So frameworks like Laravel will pre-package these components together. They glue them together with things like config files and service providers and things like that. So in general, when using a framework, someone has already made the decisions about the best components to use. Not only that, but also how they're pieced together. And yes, you can do it yourself. But if you don't have a framework, where do you start? And you're probably going to start with routing HTTP requests. And when you're doing that, then you're probably going to start evaluating what router you need, and then the syntax of your routes file. Where are you going to put the routes? How are you going to configure the routes? And before you know it, you basically built this intricate web of components. But what happens when another developer comes and looks at your project? Of course, you've documented everything as you've been doing this, right? You can hand them the documentation and say, this is how it works. But then, you've got to think of the syntax of your routes file. Where do you put it? How do you controllers interact with those routes and things like that? And what happens when you do this on 2 projects or 4 projects or 10 projects? Right? Everything's going to be a little bit different if you're going to do this by hand. So the frameworks realistically are all about consistency and flexibility. Now I'm not saying don't build your own framework. It's, a rite of passage for a lot of developers. They're going to go out and they're going to, I can do this, I'm going to write the next framework, whatever, the next Symfony, the next Laravel, the next whatever. It's great from a learning experience perspective, but seriously consider whether you want to put that into a workplace production environment. So frameworks aim to solve many of the problems of hand rolling. Okay, they're going to ensure that your chosen components work well together. They will provide conventions around how those components should be used that reduce the amount of code that a new developer has to understand. Okay, so anything that is written in Laravel, in one Laravel project, is going to be the same in the next project. So for example, routing. Routing in Laravel is going to be the same in the next Laravel project that you look at. There's nothing changes. And the best frameworks, not just Laravel, but the best frameworks will not only provide the solid foundation, but they're flexible enough to let you customize and do things your own way. So understanding why Laravel requires understanding a little bit of the history of what came before it. And there are a number of other frameworks and movements, both in PHP and web development spaces in general. And probably the most common, most popular, most well-known one is Ruby on Rails. Does anyone know what Ruby on Rails is? Has anyone used it? Yeah, hands and heads nodding, that's good. So Ruby on Rails was born in 2004, and it's pretty hard to find a framework now that wasn't at least in some way influenced by Ruby on Rails. So it really popularized the model view controller pattern, RESTful APIs, convention over configuration, which is a big part of the way Laravel goes about its business, and Rails and Symfony and things like that. And it was clear to many that Rails and similar frameworks were a vision of the future. And then we had this influx of PHP frameworks. So we had Cake PHP, which was really the first flavour of PHP framework, which came in 2005. It was followed soon after by Symfony and CodeIgniter, Zend and Kohana. Yi came in 2008, Aura and Slim in 2010. Some were focused more on the Railsy kind of approach on more rapid development. The Symfony and Zend tend to focus more on enterprise and e-commerce kind of solutions. CodeIgniter was arguably the most popular of the independent frameworks. It was simple, it was easy to use, it had great docs and a great community. But its use of modern technology and patterns started to fall behind. PHP 5.3 came out, and as more frameworks appeared and PHP's tooling advanced, CodeIgniter started falling behind. And while this was happening, Taylor Otwell, the creator of Laravel, sort of came in at 5.3. That was his first introduction for PHP. So if anyone has used PHP in version 4, 5.1, 5.2, you'll note that from 5.3 onwards, things have changed quite dramatically, and it's shifted quite heavily to a more object-oriented environment. So Laravel 1, 2, and 3, which were early, they were rapidly developed. The first beta of Laravel version 1 came out in June of 2011, and it was completely written from scratch. So I know I said don't do it. Obviously be really considerate of whether this works. Laravel was originally written by Taylor as the basis for the work that he was doing at HelpSpot. I'm going to forget now. HelpSpot. HelpSpot. Yeah, it is Spot. Yeah, HelpSpot. Yeah. Help Scout, Help Spot. That always throws me. Yeah. So, it was from scratch. It featured a custom object relational mapper. It had closure-based routing, which was largely inspired by Ruby Sinatra. It had module system for extension, helpers for forms validation, authentication, and so on. And early development moved really quickly. So Laravel 2 came out in November of 2011. Laravel 3 came out in February of 2012. By the time we had Laravel 4, Composer was now ubiquitous and showing signs of becoming industry standard. So Laravel was rewritten again from scratch as a collection of components that were bundled together and distributed using Composer. It was all written under, all of these components still exist today in the Eliminate namespace. And originally slated as Laravel 4.3, Laravel 5 came out, and the development of this version of Laravel made it clear that they weren't just going to go to 4.3, they had to go like a whole new major release. So that was 5.4. So why Laravel over one of the other frameworks? And a lot of it is personal in nature. You might choose to use Symfony, you might choose to use Kohana, or you might use Yi, or whatever Cake, whatever it is you use. It's important to not get caught up in flaming people over their choices. Like, everyone has different needs, and every framework is going to fit different purposes for different people. So the developer happiness is the primary concern of Laravel. It's had a huge impact on the way Laravel is written. It's had a huge impact on the style of the code and the decision-making process. So it has a very, it's all about equipping and enabling developers. It has a very shallow learning curve. It really tries to cut the number of steps between when you start a new application and when you publish that application for users to start using. So it's quick to learn, it's quick to start, and it's quick to develop. It lets you write code that's simple, clear, and long-lasting. So it's not just the framework, but there's also the entire ecosystem around development through to deployment. So there's Homestead and Laravel Valet for developing applications. There's Forge for server management. There's Envoy for more advanced deployment strategies. Happy developers write the best code, right? If you're happy with what you're doing, you're going to write it better. You're going to write more of it. And there's also a whole host of first-party packages, things for handling payments and subscriptions, things for handling WebSockets, search, API authentication, social login, things like Twitter, Facebook, Google. It really does remove the repetitive work of your job so that as developers you can focus on what's specific and unique to your application. I'm not going to read that, you can read that, but I will. One of the distinguishing elements of Laravel that has contributed largely to its growth and success is the welcoming teaching community that surrounds it. So anyone who's had any experience with Laravel will know that you've got Jeffrey Way doing Laracast video tutorials, you've got Laravel News pumping out article after article, day after day, you've got the Slack and IRC communities, there's literally thousands of people on Twitter, there's people writing blogs, sharing their experiences and teaching new things, there's the Laracon conferences. Laravel has a very rich and vibrant community of folks who've been around since day one, and you've got people that are always starting their first day. So that's a little bit about the history, about the community. Any questions? Shall I forge on? Hello world. So this is, in its simplest form, how you would build an application. So you would have a route, and there's a couple of different ways of doing it. This is a very simple way. In a single file, you would define a route that is a GET request to /, so the root URL of your application, and when you get there, we're going to return hello world. That's all it's going to do. That is the simplest of all applications in most languages. You'll have a hello world example. This is how you do it in Laravel. The alternative is to do it in a closure-based route. So instead of defining your return in the closure, you would say, for the same thing, get the base URL and farm that off to the welcome controller's index method, which looks basically like that. So you'd have your controller, it's got an index method, and it returns hello world. Why Laravel? Matt wrote this book, which I recommend to anyone who wants to learn. The book itself, I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but it's basically a good step through of I'm familiar with PHP, but I've never used Laravel, all the way through to the really advanced concepts around it, around queuing, events, broadcasting, jobs, things like that. All right, so you have a number of different options in developing in Laravel, which is a modern PHP framework. So if you're using anything earlier than PHP version 5.6.4, you're going to have to upgrade or find another way of getting onto a modern version. So the current version of Laravel 5.4 is 5.6.4. The next version of Laravel 5.5, which will be out in the end of July, will require PHP 7. So it's really on the back of a lot of the work that Symfony is doing as well, really trying to promote keeping PHP moving. Now that we've got that baseline, I talked about it last month's meeting, we really want to keep moving the language forward and keeping people up to date as much as possible. So you realistically can use what you already know, MAMP, WAMP, LAMP, XAMPP, whatever all the other AMP acronyms are. For those of you who don't know, you've got Mac, Apache, MySQL, PHP, or Windows, or X is for Linux. Then there's Laravel Valet, which is a Mac-only thing, but it's a lightweight local environment. It makes it really easy to basically point at a directory on your computer and say, for every folder in here, map it to a domain. So you have a folder in there called Nucleus, you'd have a domain called nucleus.dev, and everything in there would be served. It handles all of that kind of stuff for you. Then you've got Laravel Homestead, which is a vagrant provision virtual machine, which works in VirtualBox. It works flakily on Hyper-V and also in whatever the other one is, Parallels. And it makes it much easier to essentially replicate your production environment in development, particularly if you're going to use Laravel Forge for server management. So those two things are going to be pretty on par feature-wise. But creating a project...
No Laradoc?
No Laradoc, no, we don't talk about Windows here, I'm afraid. If you subscribe to the Church of Laravel, you're definitely using a Mac. So. So there are these are the two common ways of spinning up a new Laravel project. You can use the Laravel installer. So you would install the installer into your Composer's global require path. And then anytime you want to spin up a new project, Laravel new, whatever the project name is, this will create the directory structure. It'll pull down the latest version, get you all set up and running. This is essentially a simplified, faster way of running this Composer create project command from the Laravel repository into this project name, which will become the directory, and then you want to use the dist, so it'll grab you the zip file, I believe, rather than cloning the entire repository down. The core settings of your Laravel application live in the files in the config folder, and the files are just returning an array. Don't get too hung up over this environment thing. This is basically just taking a value out of your environment configuration, which you can inject into Linux environments and things like that. It's quite heavily used with Laravel, but we'll glaze over it because there's a lot to cover. Basically, use the value from app name. If it's not defined, use this default. Each value in the array will be accessible by a config key comprised of the file name, in this case app, and then each of the keys, the descendant keys can be referenced. So you'd have app.name, app.url, app.environment, and so on. Testing, which Sam covered off a couple of months ago at a high level sort of introduction to testing. Laravel includes PHP out of the box. It really simplifies testing by providing not only the default methods, but really terse method names for making assertions against your code. So things like assert status, assert view has, it makes it easy to make GET requests into your application and things like that. And then there's Laravel Dusk, which provides an easy-to-use browser automation and testing API. So that focuses a lot around actually firing up a web browser and then making assertions against the rendered output. So it's really good if you need to test JavaScript operations, for example. You can wait for something to happen on the page and then submit form data. So it makes it really easy to do that kind of testing. It's been around for a while with things like Selenium, but kind of clunky. So this really tidies that up. Currently, it will open a browser window and automate the whole process. The next version of Laravel will basically make that run headless. So it'll just give you the result. If there's an error, it'll take a snapshot of that and it'll throw it out saying, here's an error, this is what we saw, compared to what you're expecting.
That's in 5.5?
In 5.5, yeah. There are some clever uses of Dusk. Shortly after it came out, someone was actually using it to log into one of their utility providers and pay a bill every month. So, it's not just for testing applications, it can be used as like a full automation system for things like that. So routing and controllers basically call to any web framework is taking requests from a user and then delivering responses, acting on whatever that input was, figuring out what needs to be done with it, and then presenting feedback to the user. It usually starts with defining application routes. Did I spell application wrong? I did. So it starts with defining the application routes. As we talked about at the top, even if you're going to do this yourself, this is the first thing you're going to do. This is all convention over configuration, so it prescribes how this is all done. But without routes, you have no way to interact with your users. So we'll talk a little bit about the route definitions. Laravel separates out of the box web and API routes into two separate files. And I'm pretty sure in Laravel 5.4 there's also a console. So it theoretically treats console as a route point as well. So web routes are those visited by your end users in the browser. API routes are those consumed by mobile apps, AJAX requests, and so on. And then, as I said, console is defining routing to your console commands as well. And we've got this example again. In its simplest form, route get / return hello world. Does anybody know why we return hello world here instead of just spitting it out like we might do in, say, WordPress?
Buffering?
Kind of.
Pass to a view
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a few answers. The simplest is that there are many wrappers around Laravel's request and response cycle, including middleware. So when the route closure or the controller method is finished executing, the response is returned, so then it passes through those other layers. And this allows you to do things like validate form import and then redirect the user if there was an error with that input. We're using get in this example, but you can use post, you can use delete, patch, put, depending on what your route is actually doing. Does
internationalization plug into that as well?
Yep. It's covered in that book, but not in this talk. So we've got route parameters. Route parameters, it's common to use this approach where the method variable name is the same as the route parameter name, and you can spit it out. It's not required unless you're doing things like route model binding. Parameters are passed to their receiving method in the order that they're defined left to right. So if you had like something else, you could have like the greeting / name, well, greeting name. As I said, it doesn't matter whether it's name or visitor name or whatever. It's neither here nor there, as long as it makes sense to you when you're looking at it. Views. So views are files that describe what some particular output should look like. So where your controllers are defining how that data is processed and then sent to the views. The views actually describe how that looks. So you can use plain PHP and just have a welcome.php view file, or you can use Laravel's Blade templating language, and basically just the extension becomes .blade.php. It's based off of .NET's Razor. So Taylor was a .NET developer before he came over to PHP. So there's a lot of things that he's borrowed from the .NET world. There's a lot of things that have been borrowed from Ruby. A lot of things that don't exist in PHP that have sort of been brought across because they all contribute to that core concept of developer happiness, basically. But what the views do is they separate your business logic from your presentation logic. So you don't want to have to mix and match your PHP. I mean, PHP is a templating language at its core, but we've come a long way. So going back to this same example, which we'll keep building on for a couple of slides, is route get / name, then we return the welcome view, so welcome.blade in this example, and pass in the name, and this is wrong. So you would actually have 2 curly braces instead of 1, but that would spit out the variable that's come in. But as you can imagine, defining all of your business and presentation logic in your routes will get unwieldy pretty quickly. So I wouldn't recommend putting all of that stuff into your routes file.
Smarty syntax, I think.
Those were the days. Alright, so controllers are another part of the model view controller pattern. They help you to organise the logic of one or more routes together in one place, and they tend to group similar routes together, particularly if your application is structured as a traditional CRUD. So create, read, update, delete. They will typically handle all those things for a single resource. And Laravel, sadly we don't talk too much about this artisan thing. Artisan is Laravel's command line utility. It helps to run things like migrations. It gives you the ability to make controllers and migrations and models and tests and all that kind of stuff from the command line. So you don't have to copy and paste or do this. You can do it in your browser if you're using your text editor if you're using snippets. This makes it easy. It makes it consistent. Makes it the same across all of your all of your applications. You don't have to think about it. When you run this command, you will get something that looks like this. It will sit itself in the app HTTP controllers directory, in the app HTTP controllers namespace. It will automatically use the eliminate HTTP request class, which is used for handling your user input, and it extends the base controller. You don't need to extend the base controller. It does a few bits and pieces. It handles inline validation and things like that for you. If you are using the concept of single action controllers that maybe just display a static page, you can just leave that out. So basically taking what we had earlier in the closure-based route definition, the name variable is then passed in from the route into this method in the same way that it was previously, and then we return the view in the same way that we had. Have I lost anyone yet? Good. Alright, getting user input. We define 2 routes. This get route, which will display a contact form, and then a post route, which is the same endpoint, but a different HTTP verb. It'll handle the request differently. So this is to save the contact details. So you'd have a store method that is posted to from the contact route. We inject the request object, and we have 3 different ways of writing the same exact thing. Okay, so you can reference the input method on the request variable that you passed in, and then give it a key. you can use this request global helper and do the same thing with the input method, or as shorthand, you can use the request global helper and just pass it a key and it'll snag it out of the request. Save that to the database as a new contact, or you might send an email. This was a simplistic example. And then redirect the user to a thank you page. Standard sort of contact form flow. I touched on route model binding before. Laravel, a common routing pattern is to use the first line or lines, depending on how long this operation is, for a controller to find the resource for a given ID. So you would pass an ID into a URL in that placeholder, and then you would do this operation, find or fail, which will go and look at the database, see if it can return a record. If not, it will return a 404. Right? These are those things. Laravel is taking that boilerplate. You don't have to worry about it. It'll find the record and use it, or it'll redirect the user out. This is all part of that that flow of middleware and things like that. The rest of this is what we've already talked about. So Laravel provides a feature that simplifies this pattern, which is called route model binding, and it allows you to define a particular parameter name should be resolved to a particular Eloquent record. So Eloquent is Laravel's active record implementation. It's used to interact with your database. It passes the resolved record in as the parameter, not the raw value. So instead of getting an integer ID here, you would get the actual user record if one exists. The simplest way to use route model binding is to name your parameter something unique to the model, a user for example, and then type in the parameter in your method using the same variable name. If I've lost anyone, this should fix it for you. So we would use a unique name, user's user. We will then type in the user and call it user. Laravel will then do this same operation where it runs user find or fail for that user value, and it will return into this method as the user variable and instance, that found instance of the user record. So this is known as implicit route model binding. You can also do explicit route model binding if you need some other more custom logic around how you resolve that. You might need to look for an active user only, for example. Since the implicit route model binding was introduced, I've rarely found a case for explicit binding, but as I said, circumstances will change. Form method spoofing. Sometimes you need to manually define HTTP verbs. Okay, so the common ones in most applications are get and post. These are the ones that most people are familiar with. You get is when you visit a page, post is when you send some data to that page, okay? HTTP only supports get and post. Sorry, that's not true. HTTP forms, HTML forms only support get and post, okay? JavaScript, things like Laravel's built-in Axiom, sorry, not built-in, but the library that it uses handles things like put, patch, post, delete, and get. Okay, so JavaScript supports those things. HTML forms support get and post. If you need to use the other methods, which is quite common, you need to specify them yourself. But Laravel does make this easy by spoofing the unsupported methods. And it does that with a hidden input field. So there are two ways to do this. You can either write this out by hand, or you can use this handy dandy method in double curly braces this time. Method field delete, or put, or patch. The hidden method tells Laravel that the form you're submitting should be treated as something other than a regular post. And Laravel will match and route the submission as if it were actually a request with that verb. So if you say it's a patch and you pass the hidden input as patch, Laravel will then look for the corresponding route that matches the patch, and it will proceed using whatever that is, whether it's a closure or a controller or whatever. Cross-site request forgery protection. Okay. If you have ever tried submitting a form already and have come across a token mismatch exception, you have felt the power of the CSRF protection that is available out of the box on all non-read-only routes. So anything that is not a get, a head, or options request, the CSRF protection is there implicitly. By default, it requires a token to be passed along with each request. A token is generated for each user at the start of every session, and every non-read-only route compares the submitted token in the post request with what's in the session. Of course, Laravel provides a convenient way of working around this. So again, long form, short form, right? Generates the same thing, and then we've still got our delete request in there, right? they pass underscore token, CSRF token will get that from the server side and you send it back. So this protects you from people posting into your application, maybe trying to get users to do things from scam sites or whatever. It will check that each time. It will change each time the user logs in. Laravel is configured to support CSRF tokens with its suggested JavaScript HTTP client Axios. So, in the top of your application, you would place a meta tag with the name of CSRF token and the content of the generated token. This is all done in Laravel's default and included Bootstrap JavaScript file, which basically looks for this thing and then sets the default, the common headers in the Axios library to pass the XCSRF token header with that token content. Laravel automatically checks that header on every request, so any valid tokens that are passed there will mark the CSRF protection as satisfied. Okay. Compared to most backend languages, PHP functions pretty good as a templating language, but it does have its shortcomings. For example, you don't want to see the PHP opening and closing tags all over the place. It's kind of ugly to look at. It's unwieldy to do it. You forget them. Anyone who's done any templating in WordPress will know what it looks like. Most modern frameworks will include a templating language. I believe Symfony includes Twig. There's other options out there as well. Laravel offers a custom engine called Blade, which, as I mentioned earlier, is inspired by .NET's Razor engine. And it gives you concise syntax. Again, a shallow learning curve. It's powerful and intuitive inheritance, easy extensibility, lots of nice marketing things. So this is what a simple template might look like if you were iterating over a collection of users. Blade will introduce us to a convention through custom tags called directives that are prefixed with an @ symbol. The directives are used for all control structures. They're used for inheritance, for any custom functionality you can add, so you can do your own things. Something I've done recently is to wrap up like an isAdmin directive. So instead of doing at if user is admin or whatever, you can just go @isAdmin, right? And it will just render that expression for you. So the syntax is clean and concise. I don't think anyone can argue that that's particularly unreadable. It aims to be more pleasant, it's tidier than some of the alternatives. Data is escaped automatically for you when you're using this mustache notation. In earlier versions of Laravel, I think you had to use a triple mustache to escape it. You can output raw data by using mustache and then 2 exclamation points. And just like all of the best Laravel components, it takes complex requirements and makes them easy and accessible. Okay, so this for else basically is iterate over the collection of users and display their first and last name. And if there are no users, then just put a message on the screen that says there are no users. So let's whip through some control structures. Blade's if condition combines down to this. So Blade is a compiled syntax, right? So you would generate these Blade files. The first time the file is read through the Laravel's request cycle, it will compile that and then cache it. So if there's no change to it, you'll get the rendered PHP. So the @if condition will compile to a regular PHP if statement. If you've seen this syntax, you've probably spent some time in WordPress. And then @else, @elsif, @endif also compile to the exact same PHP. So you have else with braces either side of it, you have else if with braces. Else if obviously takes a condition as well, and endif just has a endif. Just like native PHP conditionals, you can mix and match these as you need them. So if, else if, else if, else if, else. Unless and end unless are not native PHP, obviously, but unlike if, there's no direct equivalent, but it is the direct inverse of if. So @unless condition is exactly the same as @if, not dollar condition. We looked at for else before, but you've got for each, and while work exactly the same way in Blade as they do in PHP. For I, echo the number. For each of the users, while item, user array pop. That @item should probably be $item. For next time. For else, we looked at at the top of this section, It's basically a for each loop that also lets you program in a fallback if the object you're iterating over is empty. So for each task, this task, display the task, otherwise you've finished all your tasks. Classic to-do example. Then we have template inheritance. So this mostly looks just like plain HTML, but you can see we've yielded in two places, here and here, as I smudge Gavin's clean TV. So with this section we've got a default, so if the title is not displayed, we'll use homepage. Yield content has no default content, and footer scripts has some default content that allows you to then reference that existing content. So all three are basically the same thing. They all define that there's a section with a given name, which is the first parameter, title, content, footer scripts. And you can extend those at a later point from your inherited templates. And so all of them define what to do if the section isn't extended, either providing the fallback for the homepage, no fallback for the content, or the script source in the footer scripts. So I guess this one warrants some further discussion. You can basically, if you ever wanted to roll this up, if you wanted to include this in a child template, you can use the @parent syntax, and that would mean that you use what's already there and then add these extra things to it, and that's where the @show comes in. So the extends directive there indicates that this template should not be rendered on its own. That it's extending another view. In this case, the layouts master, which we had here. Right. So this template's role is to define the content of the various sections, but not like it doesn't do anything on its own. Like saying for that, for the title section, I want it to be dashboard. For the content, I want it to say welcome to the application dashboard. And footer scripts, as I said, @parent. So you want to use your default application script, and then you want to have some custom dashboard JavaScript. All right. There's also the include directive. So if you're in a view and you want to display some kind of alert message, you're obviously going to copy and paste. I mean, you're not going to copy and paste that alert every time it's needed, right? You're not going to do this every time. You're not going to write it by hand. You're not going to use a snippet. You're going to use a template partial, what they're called partials. So you would say include the partials alert, pass in the parameters in this way, type and message, and then in your partial you'll just say, here is my type, here is my message. Works very similarly to how you would if you're passing in through a controller or a route closure with type with message. Okay. Include not only pulls in the partial and allows you to optionally pass things in, but it also has access to any variables defined from the including view. So anything that's available in home.blade will also be available in that partial. Laravel is primarily a PHP framework, but also has a series of components that are focused on developing in the front end. So there's things like pagination and message bags, which are PHP helpers that target the front end specifically. Laravel also provides a Webpack-based build system that's called Laravel Mix. And it allows you to have this pretty little syntax where it's basically just a configuration layer on top of Webpack. It provides a fluent API for defining Webpack build steps for your Laravel applications using common CSS and JavaScript preprocessors, things like less and Sass and post CSS and things like that. It gives you several features like compiling modern JavaScript, or also future versions of JavaScript that the browser may not render natively, such as ECMAScript 2015. Converts it down to conventional JavaScript. It handles module bundling, minification, concatenation of JavaScript files. It makes it very easy to extract any vendor libraries. So you have a separate vendor.js. Those things you wouldn't change. You might change your application, JavaScript specifically, but your vendor things, you probably want to cache them for a longer period of time so that users aren't downloading all of Vue and all of Bootstrap and all of jQuery and whatever else you're using every single time. It handles things like copying files and directories, and it makes it very easy to version your assets. So it will compile all of your JavaScript down into compiled assets with unique file names, which means that you can cache your JavaScript files for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, a year. And it means that your visitors aren't having to pull that down every time. If you were to make an update, you would generate a new version asset with a new file name, and then that would be cached for your users. So you don't have to ever worry about people getting stuck on some old version of CSS when you push a new version out. User data. So user input can come from the URL pass, from query parameters, from post data and file uploads. Websites that benefit most from a framework often don't just serve static content. If you're just serving static content, you could probably use a static site generator, something like Jigsaw, or there's a Ruby thing as well. There's Hugo and things like that. Many frameworks will deal with complex and mixed data sources. Could be coming from JSON, could be coming from form input. The most common and most complex user data is user input, of course. And Laravel provides tools for gathering, validating, normalizing, and filtering user-provided data. So the request object is the most common tool for accessing data, which we looked at earlier on. It provides an easy way to access all of the ways the user can provide input. So you can use that global request helper, or you can use a request facade, or you can inject the request object into your methods or controllers. Each of those options, whichever you choose, exposes the same methods, so you can just use whatever you're more comfortable with. So this method, if you're injecting that Laravel's container, which we won't cover today because it's a little bit more advanced and we're already pushing for time. So Laravel will know that Laravel will automatically figure out what this is and inject it for you. So you don't have to like new it up or anything in your classes. So we've got request all. So as the name suggests, it gives you an array containing all of the user provided input. Then you've got request accept and request only. They basically give you the same base input as the all method, but you can then choose one or more fields to either include or exclude. So I want everything that was in the request except for the token. Don't care about that. It's not going in my database. Or I only want the first name and the last name. The first name and the email address. Request has and request exist detect whether a particular piece of user input is available to you. So where request has will return false if the key exists in that request input but is empty. Request exists will return true if the key exists even if it is empty. So if you need to, for a checkbox for example, you might use request exists, whereas request has you use in other cases. Request input allows you to get the value of a single field, and the second parameter, as we discussed earlier, allows you to specify a default value if one was not passed. So get the first name, if there was no first name passed in the request, anonymous. Laravel provides a number of ways to validate data. And the simplest method is to use this validate method. So I spoke about extending from the base controller. This is one of the things that you get as a part of that. If the validation fails for any reason, in this case, if the title or the body were not supplied, Laravel will catch that error. It will redirect the user back with all of the original input and with any errors back to the view. And the errors are always available in a $errors variable in all of your views. So don't use $errors. Sorry, I'm a one-man show and mindful of pizza arriving. Alright, database and Eloquent. Database and Eloquent is a topic in and of itself. This is going to be really brief. I'm sorry, it's going to suck. It's not going to be nearly comprehensive enough, but hopefully it gives you a taste and maybe entices someone to give a talk next month. So Laravel provides a suite of tools for interacting with your application's databases. The most notable tool is Eloquent. There are a lot of unholy wars that go on about Laravel's active record ORM and whether or not it's the right fit for the tool, right tool for the job rather. For most cases it will be. Don't get too hung up on it if you dive into those deep dark areas. Eloquent is one of Laravel's most popular and influential features. It really drives a lot of the rapid application development aspects of Laravel. It makes it really easy to get data into and out of your database. It's simple. You have one class for one table, and it is responsible for retrieving and representing and persisting data to that table, both as the whole table and as individual records. Most modern frameworks now make it easy for you to define your database structure with code-driven migrations. Who's still writing like create and alter statements by hand? Or who's not touching a database at all? Every new table, every column, every index, every key can be defined in code. And because it's defined in code, it's easy to version, it's easy to share, and it's easy to bring a database up from a blank database up to a default schema in seconds. And migrations define two things: the modifications that you need to happen when you run the migration up and when you run the migration down. So this is Laravel's default users migration, or users table migration. So you can see we create the users table, we have an incrementing ID, we have a string called name, a string called email, which must be unique. We have a string called password, we have a remember token, we have timestamps on that table. When you run PHP Artisan migrate, it will run this up. When you run the rollback, it will then drop the table if it exists. Okay. There is some contention around whether this is valuable. In development, you're probably more likely to just crash your whole database and then run the whole thing up again. In production, this is going to be bad. Okay. A lot of the common thought these days is if you have some mistake in your database schema that you haven't picked up during development, you would create a new migration with a new up method and you would roll forward. So you would fix rather than roll back. And then, especially if you've got, dropping your whole users table, you're going to lose all of your users, right? But you could have some state that you were storing in the database that goes away if you do this. Importantly, when you're doing any of this stuff, back up your database before you run migrations.
Is there any way you can check the environment or say if not production drop or?
You can.
Like
If you're using the artisan migrate command, it will by default flag that you're in production and say, "Are you sure you want to go ahead with this?" Right?
have you got a backup?
Yeah. Basically.
And it might not even grant options to the database to drop tables on production, I would imagine as well. It's pretty unlikely you ever need that.
Database seeding has gained widespread adoption as part of normal development workflows in a way that... Yes, I can.
So with the migrations, if you want to just keep adding columns, you do them as a new migration, or you just have a single migration which is the end stage, and it doesn't matter what exists already.
Yep.
It just keeps getting
So you can add. So in this migration, you've got schema create. You've also got, I think it's schema table is the other option, and that allows you to add things to an existing database migration. The general way of going about it is if the migration has gone to production, that migration is locked. Don't change it. If you're still developing it, if you haven't pushed it into Git and other people aren't using it, feel free to change it. Roll back your databases in development, add new things to it, that's fine. Once it goes into production, my general rule of thumb is don't touch it. Yeah.
Once it's committed, really.
Yeah.
Like once it's committed in Git.
Once it's pushed to Git,
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So if it's on your machine, it's fine. Once it leaves your machine, assume someone else is using it. And you don't want conflicts and integrity issues and things like that. Okay, so seeding in Laravel is really simple. It allows you to set databases up with default data. It's useful for specifying default application user groups, roles, categories, whatever. And it's basically used to get your application configured in its default state. So when migrations get your database schema up to par, the seeds will then get any core data in there. So again, using the artisan command, you make a seeder. You tell the main database seeder that you want to call the context table seeder, which we just created, and then say, when we run this migration, in the context table, insert a contact called Dyrynda, example, so on. So this will create a single record in the context table. As I said, you can use this for generating your initial roles and permissions and things like that. Migrations, not migrations, categories if you're writing a blog, for example, or a CMS. And we've got model factories which define one or more patterns for creating fake entries for your database tables, which are particularly useful when you're doing application testing. So you could, in a test, say I need to create a user. So you would define this in your model factory define user class. Whenever you call this function, factory user create, it will return you a user object persisted to your database with a randomly generated name and a randomly generated email address. The query builder it basically lies at the center of every piece of Laravel's database functionality. You probably won't use it directly. Eloquent is built on top of it, but it is a fluent interface for interacting with your database, which is basically just a method for chaining. It's basically allows you to chain methods together in a more readable sort of way. So where you have a non-fluent interface, we would say select, and then from the table users where, and this array, which is kind of hard to read. With a fluent interface, you say select table users where type equals. This 2-parameter syntax means it's an implicit equals. If it's 3, you can pass not equals or whatever in there, and then get. So Eloquent, as I mentioned earlier, is an active record object relational mapping or mapper. It is an abstraction layer that provides a single interface to interact with different database types. So it sits on top of PDO. It allows you to talk to SQLite, to PostgreSQL, to Microsoft SQL, to MySQL. So an Eloquent class is responsible for interacting not only the table as a whole, but also presenting individual records. And that's for saving them, it's for manipulating, it's for updating them, deleting them. It's primarily focused on simplicity. And like the rest of the framework, it relies on convention over configuration. So as long as you follow the conventions around naming your columns and IDs and how you would interact with it, it gets out of your way, right? So that user model that we defined as a factory before basically looks like this. You don't have to define the table. Again, convention over configuration. The table is always the plural version of the lowercase class name. So in this case, the table would be called users. Again, huge topic. Biggest chapter in that book is around Eloquent and the database. Yes?
What happens when the model's called fish?
It becomes fishes. It figures it out. There's.
If it ends with S though, does it double the S?
It doesn't, I don't believe. Yeah, we had
That'd be
series.
intensity of like 700 hours of work.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is
And it
built on
works in French and it works in Polish.
Yeah, sheep.
sheep is sheep. So this is built on top of a Symfony component, so it's obviously battle tested. It's used by lots and lots of big corporations.
This is in Doctrine. So.
Yeah, but you
Voice
can also
files
define the table name while you go it.
Yeah, you could put a protected property table if you need to use something that's not. Like, follow the conventions as often as possible if you need to break out of it. The tools are there. As I said, Laravel follows convention over configuration, but it's also very flexible.
Regardless, you didn't care about the table name.
No, you don't. You don't have to care. Well, apart from a new migration.
Unless you're trying to link into a legacy system that is already built for you.
Yeah.
That doesn't follow the conventions.
Which
Laravel.
Laravel surprisingly works really, really well with that. I had to do that
Well, I'm
recently.
linking it up with an MS SQL system that is.
Do they have plurals for their table
No.
names?
There's nothing
You
to
got to
do
define
with
it.
the data in them.
Sorry, please continue.
Alright, mindful of the pizza. So, interacting with the table as a whole, user : all. Select star from users. Interacting with a single record. User, new user, username equals Jordan, user save, right? You created a new record, which will then be returned by user all. Alright, some rough examples comparing Eloquent with the Fluent Builder. It's less of this, more of getting things done, right? DB table users get, or user all. DB table users insert array of things, user create array of things. Very common in Laravel is like this notion of making code readable. If you look at it left to right, you read it left to right. It reads a lot of times in Laravel. You will go, "What is this thing called? This sounds like it's what it should be." A lot of the times, it will just be there. There's a lot of focus on that. That is the end of the talk. You're welcome. This book is like 600 pages long. There is a lot of things in there. I would love to cover more of it in the future, but I would also love other people to maybe give some talks about this stuff or other things as well. I will not be here next month, so good luck, I guess. We'll have someone speak. It'll be alright. The book, Laravel Up and Running, the best way to learn. This is from the website. I agree. However, it is the best way. If you like to read and that's how you absorb information, this book is the best way to learn Laravel. It was written by Matt Stauffer from this company, Titan Co. It's basically a book that is for capable PHP developers that are new to Laravel framework. It's the book that Matt wrote for anyone basically who is coming to their business, to Titan, and wanted a job, and it was basically a way of saying, if you don't know Laravel, this is how we want you to learn it from start to finish. These are the core concepts. It starts with routing, it starts with controllers and all that stuff in a way that you would approach it if you were learning the framework for the first time and the things that you need to learn from start to finish. So that's at laravelupandrunning.com. There is a secret domain name that I can tell you about after the meeting. The other one is Laracast, which is a video-based version. It is entirely run by a great guy called Jeffrey Way. It is the most concise screencast for the working developer. It is literally updated every single day of the work week, which for us will translate to Tuesday to Saturday because of time zones. But it started originally as a heavy Laravel focus. It is now targeting all kinds of... It targets specific PHP stuff, it targets the front end, it targets Laravel, and all kinds of bits and pieces. It's like $9 a month. Sign up for a month, learn something, I guarantee it. There's a lot of free things on there. Laravel 5.5 is coming out end of July, as I said. That series will be free. It's in the progress of being refreshed now. So if you want to learn and hit the ground running for 5.5 when it comes out next month, definitely check out Laracast. Are there any questions? You can ask me anything, even if I didn't talk about it as long as it's about Laravel. Well,
the only one is, it's way back with the routing configs, is how does it know to look in the web or the API?
So the routes are all compiled down, right?
Okay.
So web and API are both web routes.
Yeah.
So they both exist in the same place. Console is handled by a separate... So Laravel has got this concept of kernels. So there's a HTTP kernel, which handles those, which are defined in your route service provider, and then there's a console kernel, which handles the console route specifically.
So you can't have the
API
same
routes
routes
by default are under the /API namespace. So your request will be your site/API and then whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can specify in the route service provider, which is how Laravel handles configuration through all these service providers, is you'll see in there that it's defined the web and the API, but you can add your own.
Yeah.
So you can have another file called Stuart.php, and you can have Stuart routes in there. Yeah.
So there was awesome things. What are some of the things that it's not so good at, or you would not recommend using Laravel for?
It covers a lot of my use cases, right? I haven't. There are times where I have not. Sorry, hasn't been a time yet where I have found that it hasn't done what I wanted. There are times where I've had to bend it a little bit. The way that it assumes that jobs and queues work are, it assumes that Laravel is putting something onto the queue, and it assumes that Laravel is taking something off of the queue, so that Laravel will be operating on both ends of it. If you're in an example that we had at work, we were putting things onto the queue in Laravel, but we'll take some off in just a custom role application. So we had to tackle that a little bit different. It provided all the tools, but they're not really well documented. As I said, Laravel follows convention over configuration. So anything that sort of chips away at the edges, it's a little less nice about. Does anyone who's used Laravel, is there anything you can think of? Like, there's nothing for me personally that it hasn't been able to do.
Within the Symfony community, usually people bash it for performance.
Yeah.
That's usually
yeah, it's the same thing. And I mean,
they're probably just Symfony developers.
A lot of it is on par now, and really, if you want performance, you're probably not going to use PHP at all.
Yeah.
So solving imaginary scaling issues that your company doesn't have.
Yeah.
You're not Facebook.
That's right. Yeah. Look, Laravel running on PHP. Lumen is like a micro framework that was released when before Laravel was running on PHP 7, before PHP 7 was out. And it was designed to solve a lot of problems around speed. If you're just doing APIs, you needed like really responsive endpoints. Laravel running on PHP 7 now is faster than what the Lumen was. So a lot of it is the language. You hit some bottlenecks. They're not, like we're talking milliseconds here. It's not issues that you really need to worry about too much. I mean, and again, I say don't have to worry too much. Depends on your situation where you're deploying these things to. Symfony, Laravel, Aura, Kate. Anyone else?
I have lots of questions, but I'm hungry.
Okay. I'll find that too. Alright, well, I'll wrap up. Thank you. Me on Twitter, me on my podcast. Plural. Alright, very good. Well, that is all.